All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We're really um, we're really excited to be having this conversation and this dialogue tonight. And I just want to start by saying thank you for being here and being part of the conversation. I am going to be monitoring the chat throughout today's call. So on the bottom of your screen, if you're new to Zoom, there might be some folks who still haven't used it yet. But either way, there's a little chat button at the bottom there that you can use, and there'll be plenty of time for us to ask you questions and get some feedback, and also for you to ask questions of our presenters as well. So please make use of that. So this is our agenda for tonight's call. So I'm going to turn it over to Kat Sandigo from the ADL.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. So like Andrew said, we are all really happy and excited to be here. This is a really important topic to Andrew, both personally and professionally. So today we're going to be covering quite a few different things. So of course, who are we? The interesting part of today's call is going to be, what does Judaism say about this? We're going to cover what talking about race matters, or why talking about race matters. Developing a common language, so going over some general definitions, why these words are important to know, and some examples of those, some real life examples. We're going to do a breakout discussion, which will not be recorded. That portion will not be recorded at all. We're going to be covering our ADL Pyramid of Hate, and then we'll have time for a Q&A session. So ADL, along, I'm sure with Jewish Nevada, believes in a wide variety of these things on here. But one of the things that, as the education director of my organization, we believe is that bias is universal, but that it can be unlearned. Because prejudice is a learned behavior, it can be challenged and overcome. And I really hope that's why everyone is here today. Not just the Jewish community, but our community around us is a diverse and wonderful place. And we all have so many wonderful things to learn from one another. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Rabbi Mintz to introduce herself.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Rabbi Yocheved Mintz. I'm the Rabbi Emerita of Congregation Pnei Tikva and member of the Board of Rabbis of Southern Nevada.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, is this me? Good evening, everybody. My name is Carmen LaShawn Miller. I'm an educator here in Las Vegas. However, I have been directly involved in issues of this nature since 1990, but I was born into this situation. I am a proud daughter of an original freedom writer. So this has been a part of my family's learning experience. And I am just so glad to be here and be a part of this dialogue and open up doors and answer questions, because I think we're at a great shift in our community right now.
Oh, that's me. Hi, I am the Director of Outreach and Engagement for Jewish Nevada. It's a really exciting time in our community, and I will tell you more about what Jewish Nevada does in a little bit.
And I'm Kat Sandigo. I'm the Education Director of the Anti-Defamation League here in Nevada. I was a former educator here in Southern Nevada and in North Carolina, and like I said, this is something that is personally important to me because I see the difference that we have in our community, the different people, and the wonderful things that everyone brings together. So being able to have a conversation and understand really what, our belief, our faith system says about this is important to me. So with that, just some fast facts about the civil rights movement and Jewish involvement. American Jews have for a long time played a very significant role in the founding and starting of different organizations, including the NAACP, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The photo over here is of our former National Director, Benjamin Epstein, who worked with Martin Luther King and attorney Robert F. Kennedy back during the original civil rights movement. I think something that's important and interesting also to note is that Jews made up over half of the young people who participated in that Freedom Summer during 1964, which to me is so important. And that is something that we can continue to foster in our future children and in our community. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rabbi Mintz to lead us in our next part.
You know, this is a time where everybody's wearing masks, but Elie Wiesel, may rest in peace, is quoted as saying, "Hate wears many masks. It comes disguised as racial or religious superiority, or it can wear the mask of patriotism or revolution. It is the cancer at the root of human relationships among individuals and entire nations. But strangely, the phenomena of hate itself and the evil it fosters has rarely been addressed. Although hate has been with humankind since the beginning, it remains an uncharted sickness in the human soul." End quote. Our tradition is replete with calls for justice. We know from Deuteronomy, the famous tzedek, tzedek tirdof, pursue righteousness, pursue the right thing. We know lo ta'amod al dam re'echa, do not stand on the blood of your fellow. Of course, we hear v'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, treat your fellow as you would treat yourself. But there are other things as well. For instance, in the Jerusalem Talmud, Brachot 9:1, there is a bracha for when one sees a black-skinned, red-skinned, or white-skinned person. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who diversifies the creatures, as if one is different from another. Also, in our Torah, we read about Miriam and Aaron speaking up against their brother Moses. Why? Because Moses married a Cushite woman. There's a protest prayer by April Baskin I'd like to share with you. Beloved siblings striving for justice, Shema, listen closely. At all times, my prayer for you is that you remember protest is a sacred act. Just as the mourner's Kaddish helps souls ascend to God, may our cries soothe those whose lives were prematurely extinguished and rattle the bones and stones of leaders and institutions, leaving no question about the fact that things are never going back, only forward. For more of us are clear that we have nothing to lose but our chains. We affirm we are a multiracial people, and we will stand strong, humble, and proud as we follow and work in partnership with Black leaders, taking steady strides in the direction of collective liberation. And I'd like to end my section with a prayer that has taken on special meaning. This is found in the Mishkan Tefillah prayer book. Disturb us, Adonai. Ruffle us from our complacency. Make us dissatisfied with the peace of ignorance, the quietude which arises from the shunning of the horror, the defeat, the bitterness, and the poverty, physical and spiritual, of humans. Shock us, Adonai. Deny to us the false Shabbat, which gives us the delusions of satisfaction amid a world of war and hatred. Wake us, O God, and shake us from the sweet and sad poignancies rendered by half-forgotten melodies and rubric prayers of yesteryears. Make us know that the border of the sanctuary is not the border of living, and the walls of your temples are not shelters from the winds of truth, justice, and reality. Disturb us, O God, and vex us. Let not your Shabbat be a day of torpor and slumber. Let it be a time to be stirred and spurred to action. And I would add, as we learned from Rabbi Heschel, let us pray with our feet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about, briefly, what Jewish Nevada is and why this is such an important conversation for us right now. So Jewish Nevada is the communal and philanthropic organization of the Jewish community in Nevada, the entire state. So we raise funds and then we invest those funds in both our own programming and by providing grants to over 70 organizations in Las Vegas, in Northern Nevada, across America, in Israel, and around the world. And of course, we don't take a political stand on any issue, but we always respond to current events. You know, we don't live in a bubble. We live in such a diverse community, in such a diverse country, in such a diverse world that despite us all being at home, seems to be increasingly flatter than ever before. So in much more eloquent terms than I could write myself, I just want to take a moment and read a couple of statements, one from the Jewish Federation of North America and another from Jewish Nevada. So the first, the Jewish Federations of North America is outraged and sickened by the violence of the Minneapolis police officers that led to the death of George Floyd. We share in the heartbreak, pain, and sorrow provoked by his loss and the memory of many others through sordid acts of hate and bigotry. May their memory be for a blessing. We pledge to our brothers and sisters in the Black community and all communities of color to work together to reverse the systemic racism embedded within our country's institutions and society in general. Our work won't be easy. Revered civil rights icon Congressman John Lewis reminded us this week, nothing worth having ever is. In the strongest terms, we also condemn those who are taking advantage of the anguish over George Floyd's death by hijacking what would be peaceful rallies across the country for their own violence and destructive agenda. These acts threaten our Jewish communities as well as our democracy as a whole. We commit to partnering with community leaders to ensure the safety of all who are at risk. Together, we can and must be stronger than hate. We will stand and fight for a world free of racism and bigotry in all its forms, as we always have. And from Jewish Nevada, we said this week, this is actually going back now a couple of weeks, but I think that the message is still just as timely. This week has reminded us yet again that we all have a long way to go in the work towards a more just society for all. We are outraged and saddened by the tragic death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we stand with the African American community and all communities in mourning the deaths of Mr. Floyd and countless others who have lost their lives simply because of the persistent racism that afflicts our nation. Our Jewish traditions and values compel us to stand up for the rights of all people without prejudice or bias, and we acknowledge that words are not enough. We are committed to helping to build a safe and secure community for all people, to providing equal opportunity for everyone, and we will continue to support the organizations and agencies that do this every day. We will not stop fighting for a world free of racism and bigotry in all its forms. And that line, that last line is very, very important, right? Because Jewish federations have been, for more than a century now, the essential catalyst for building flourishing Jewish communities at home and supporting Jewish people around the world. That's work that we will continue to do for another century and beyond, I'm sure. But the success of that mission, of the work that we do, that has always depended on the strength of civil societies in which we live. And that means that we must be committed to ending racism and bigotry in all forms, right? So there are a number of Jewish organizations who are doing great work that I'm really proud of, that I want to share with you. So the Union of Reform Judaism is working to make sure that their synagogues are welcoming for all people, including radically welcoming to people of color. Bend the Arc and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice are leading some of the protests we've seen on TV. The Jewish Public Affairs Committee is doing education on what Black Lives Matter means, how to dispel myths about what the protests and what the demands are. And the National Council for Jewish Women is advocating for police reform in states around the country right now. Now, that is a very short list. If you're on this call, you probably already know that the alphabet soup of Jewish organizations is quite large, but that's a small piece of what the organized part of our community is doing. So getting back to Jewish federations in North America and local federations like Jewish Nevada, this means three basic steps. There's more to this, but I do want to highlight these. So it's about a commitment of raising voices of Jews of color, strengthening the racial equity and equality alliances, and supporting meaningful police reform. A recent demographic study of the Jewish community of America found that about 10% of the Jewish community in America considers themselves to be Jews of color. So we have an intersection here of our community's goals are very much aligned, but also we have an intersection of the people who are working together. Our partners and other community members were there for us and have been time and time again. And I was working for a local synagogue during the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting, and the outpouring of support from our friends and allies was overwhelming. And we have built those relationships, and it's important for us to maintain and strengthen them. And finally, for a number of obvious reasons, which I just alluded to partly, we work with police as partners in our community and in just about every community. And I hope that by building partnerships with police and with our allied communities of color, that we can affect real change. And so I think that programs like this are really important because, as I said, as an organization, we don't have a political message. We aren't here to tell anyone what to believe, how to act, what the best model for large-scale change is. But what we have to do is work as partners with our allies, and we have a vested interest in ending racism and bigotry. So we have an important role. You have an important role. While you may believe that systemic change is important, the influence of what is happening in our living room, in our living rooms and our Zoom conversations, and as we get back into the real world right now, the conversations that we're going to be returning to, that is an important part of affecting change. So how to have these difficult conversations with friends and family and coworkers is crucial, and I am so happy that we could take part of this. There are a lot of guides for how to educate yourself and others around you, and the follow-up email from this conversation that will include this video. Hi to everybody who are watching later on YouTube. But the email that you'll get tomorrow will have a number of resources. My favorite from a Jewish perspective, especially for the under 45 crowd on this call, is from Moishe House. So please, when you get that message tomorrow, check that out. And thank you again for being part of this conversation on how to have a conversation.
Thank you, Andrew. Can we share the screen again, and we'll pass it over to Ms. Carmen to lead us off on our first activity. There you go. Oh, hold on.
Mute myself. There you go.
Yeah.
I made the error this time too. Thank you. Why talking about race matters? I know that at this moment, a lot of people feel that this is a repeating action, but it's a repeating action because an action hasn't been taken to really stop it. We've gone through progress, and then we go back a little more and forward. And this is not going to be an easy conversation, but hopefully we'll provide you with tools on how to have dialogues on how to start a conversation about race in general when having the conversation. Now, I could teach a whole class about race being a social construct that was brought about in the 15th century, and we'd be here all day, but that's not what we're really here about. We're really more here to talk about some known things. Everyone in this group right now, you have a racialized identity that has been placed upon you as a narrative of yourself. And that does affect your thought processes, how you respond to particular things, how you may have been raised, how you may worship. There's a lot of that is happening. And that's why it's important that you talk about those things. Here, and particularly in the United States, your racialized identity is a part of your everyday life, be it from your waking up to your sleeping moment, that it's there, that it happens. I know that there's some terminology that's going to be brought up where we'll talk about the issue of people saying, well, I'm colorblind. And that's really not a good place to start, because to say that means that I don't see the individual that I'm engaging with, because there's certain things that have to happen. And of course, race is defining a social construct in American life. How we get up in the morning, how we dress, how we engage in other people. Do I watch the inflection of my voice because someone may interpret it another way? And we'll get a little bit more into that. But it's a good conversation. It's a building conversation. Sometimes it's going to be easy and it'll start just like that. Sometimes it'll have a little conflict in it, and conflict is not a bad thing. It's about if you stay on focus about what we're really talking about. And it's very, very important that we do have these conversations, and particularly when we're dealing with children, because we're dealing with a different kind of generational mindset with children, which I know Kat will be talking about in a little bit about that. So that's one of the reasons why it's important that you do talk about race and why it matters.
Thank you. So in just a second, we're going to be going over some important key terms. The first one here is implicit bias. Implicit bias is the idea that it's something unconscious. It's an attitude, stereotype, or unintentional action, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, towards a member of a group merely because of their membership in that group. Carmen, would you like to share an example with us?
Well, one of the examples that's the one that's the easiest to kind of start the dialogue is they talk about particular things such as, with all this wonderful technology, you can pull up old magazine shows from 60 Minutes about hailing a cab and how people interact with that. Different sounding names, and will this person's resume get looked at before another person is. Not talking about looking at their skill base just on first blush is the stereotypes. In certain cultural aspects, the use of your hands, how the tone of your voice, inflection. These are kind of like these unconscious values. Oh, she's talking fast. Oh, she must be angry, versus that's just a way to express yourself. So they're one of the examples that's posted up there. Again, it's from the National Bureau of Economic Research that did this study of names on a resume and who got seen first.
Absolutely. So the other word on this page is privilege. Privilege is an unearned and often unrecognized advantage, benefits, or rights that are conferred upon people based on the membership of a dominant group, i.e. white people or heterosexual people, men, people without disabilities, beyond what is commonly experienced by the members of a marginalized group.
And we're living in a great example of privilege right now, in particular the engagement with law enforcement, learning about other people's backgrounds in school, if you have not been exposed to that, or what does that mean? If it's not what I know, if it's strange, then it must be bad. So, I mean, you're getting to see a lot of that if you're watching today's news, or if you're sitting in a coffee shop and just take a moment and listen to that, and about stereotypes and what people what people have perceived in terms of negative connotations toward people.
Absolutely. Carmen, I'll let you take this one.
Oh, race, okay. This is obviously categories of what society places on individuals based off of their characteristics, be it skin coloring, hair type, facial form structures, brow shape, ear shape, neck shape, shoulder shape, things of that nature, that many believe that that's determined by biology. I always joke about this. If Andrew got into a car accident and I happen to have his same blood type and he needs a blood transfusion and his family gives permission, Andrew is not going to turn into a 55-year-old woman of color if he gets my blood. Okay, so that's the kind of things that go on. But then you also have some labelings that are very based off of your culture in which you've been raised: African American, Asian American, Indigenous, Native. Then you go into binary, your pronouns, things of that nature. And it's just kind of how you are defined within society.
Awesome. The other word on that slide was racism, which is one of the many reasons we're here today, and that is the marginalization or the oppression of people of color based on a socially constructed idea that white people have more privilege than other people do. And extreme examples of racism include things like lynching, hate crimes, which is what we've witnessed recently, and the use of racial slurs towards marginalized groups of people.
Definitely. And the implementation of power, that I can say what I need to say, and it's my way of demonstrating superiority or supremacy over you. And that element of power has to be there.
Absolutely. And the last but not least is structural racism. Sometimes it's also called systematic racism or systemic racism. It is a combination of systems and factors that advantage white people and other people of color, or against other people of color, to cause widespread harm and disadvantages in access and opportunity. One person or even one group of people did not create this, but it is all something that we can help to dismantle. And I'm going to let Carmen explain the example of this.
Okay. Is this the lovely chart of
It
wealth,
is.
the wealth gap?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so data, everyone wants data to show this. This graph that you're looking at right now talks about who controls the levels of wealth within our country. Where are the streams of revenue actually going? So if you look at the population based off of your white, we'll just use white and African American, 77% of the population is white in our nation, and they hold 90% of the stream of wealth revenue in our country, whereas the African American population is 13% and is African American, and they only hold 2.6% of wealth. And there's a difference between wealth and being rich. Okay, wealth is long stream, generational access to that revenue and that ability that takes place. Some people go, we have a lot, this person is making a lot of money, then why isn't this right? There's a difference between wealth and there's a difference between being rich. Another example, just to kind of give you something to deal with, is if you go through the history of our nature, who owned land? And how that revenue of wealth came for is by the ownership of land. So that is what is considered structural racism. You've probably heard things such as being grocery store starved or in a grocery store desert. Okay, that's access. So you have to spend money in order to get to a grocery store in order to feed your family. That money's not going back into your community to generate wealth. It's being spent out and someone else is getting that. And majority of the time, based off the data, that is someone that is white.
Absolutely.
And if I could, I don't mean to interrupt here, but if I could, I want to share the intersection here. When we're talking about biases, whether recognized or implicit, as you may know from the show Mad Men, Jewish sounding names were not very welcomed on Madison Avenue in the 1950s. And my grandfather worked in advertising, worked on the creative side of advertising on Madison Avenue in Manhattan in the 1950s. Mad Men was literally about an office very similar to his. And his name was Philip Dickstein, but he went by Dick Phillips because with the last name Dickstein, he wasn't going to get a job on Madison Avenue. Exactly. And so if we're going to break down biases against one group of people, that isn't possible. That means that we are working at an intersection of breaking down those biases for everybody.
That is correct, Andrew. That's a very, very extremely important, because intersectionality has to be a part of this process, because that's always been the problem where we don't make progress, because there's a mindset of this doesn't affect me until it does. And now we're at a tipping point where it does affect your life. So that intersectionality is there, and you are quite correct of people that change names. I even had family members change their names in order so that they could try to chase after that wealth stream to bring it back into the community. So you are correct, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you, both of you, so much, Andrew. It was really helpful too. Before we enter into our discussion session, I'm going to be sending you all into breakout rooms for just a few moments. It won't be very long and it won't be recorded. So we'll be going over the questions beforehand. So something important to think about here is that, just like Carmen and Andrew both shared about intersectionality, and this is something that the ADL firmly believes in, is that you can't fight one form of hate without fighting all forms of hate, which is why we're here today. And as a people, as a Jewish people, we stand up for everyone, including ourselves, and we show up. And we help lift up those marginalized voices. So these are some questions for discussion. I will be sending you out into these breakout rooms here in just a second. This first question is, when were you first aware of your race? What do you remember from childhood about how you made sense of human differences? Maybe what confused you? How, if ever, did an adult give you help thinking about these things? And what role do you think Judaism plays in helping with social justice issues? So again, we are all here to learn and share. So please, in your breakout rooms, be kind and respectful. Hurtful, rude, and unkind behavior will not be tolerated. So in just a second, I'm going to pause the recording and I will send folks out into breakout rooms. You'll be in groups of 3 to 4. So just bear with me one moment while I get this situated. Andrew, if you could copy and paste the questions into the chat, that'd be very helpful for me. Before we move on, this is our next section's important considerations. We want to share with all of you just some important things that we can keep in mind when having these kinds of conversations. So something important to keep in mind is consider the racial composition of your space. It might be a situation in which folks aren't really exposed to things, so they're not comfortable with it. Connecting the past to the present, encouraging empathy, inspire hope and activism, especially in young children. Recognize that young children aren't colorblind. They know what's going on around them. They know that people look different, and it's okay to talk about that, because it's okay to not just talk about our similarities, but also talk about our differences. There's no problem with that. And in fact, it's helpful oftentimes, because kids oftentimes see things that we don't. Andrew? And specifically when discussing incidents of hate is to prepare yourself emotionally. You know, there's never a good time to have a conversation about a tragic event, but you can do your best to put yourself in a good mindset. Open the conversation about what they're hearing. The one thing that I can say is most effective with anyone, not just children, is to ask open-ended questions. What are you hearing? What are people around you saying? What are the things you're fearful of? What are the things you're scared of? Because it doesn't pigeonhole anyone into having one type of answer. Especially with children, answer questions matter-of-factly and with respect. Kids don't understand a lot of things, and it's our job to help them, to help guide them through those things. We want them to be alert for signs of distress, especially with adults. Some of us probably have family members that we get into conversations with, and when you've reached that tipping point. Be mindful of that. If you want to see growth come out of the conversation, be mindful of those things and say, you know what, I think maybe we take a break from this conversation. We'll come back together afterwards. And lastly is to focus on taking action. What are things that you can do? And in just a second, we're going to go over a few of those, and then we'll move on to questions and answers. So what can you do to be an ally? There's a lot of things that you can do to be an ally. A few of the suggestions that we have as an organization is to talk about what happened. Mm-hmm. It's not a secret. Hopefully most people know what's going on in the world, but it's okay to talk about it. It's not going to make it worse. If we keep talking about it, we might actually create some sort of change. And then the last one for me before I pass it over to Carmen to share some of her activism ideas is to get involved locally. Reach out to organizations that support communities of color. Reach out to organizations that you can help with. We were working with another presenter for a different program, and one of their suggestions was micro donations. And it may not seem like $5 or $10 would do a lot, but it means a lot to a grassroots organization. There's plenty of organizations here in Southern Nevada that work with communities of color that would be very pleased to work with you. And maybe it's your time that you have to give. There's people who are looking to make phone calls right now, send out emails, all sorts of different things. Carmen, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think you're right on the button for it. I think one of the favorite sayings that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would always talk about is everybody can do something, anything. Nothing's too big, nothing's too small. If it's walking into your neighborhood and introducing yourself and I'm Miss such and such, or I'm Mr. such and such, just creating that connection, that oneness as community, very, very popular. One of the things I always encourage, and this is the educator in me, is you are walking, breathing history books of experiences that other people have not seen. Go volunteer in a school. They are always looking for that. Write letters, phone call, bank, write the newspaper. With social media, you can type a blog and put it out there, and it'll get picked up, it'll get shared. Be in the conversation, engage in agencies that do this. Say, how can I help? What can I do for you? Because right now, and particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement that's happening right now, is they need your voices. They're a little exhausted and they need your voices. They need other people to see, oh, this does affect me. So just those little things, little tiny steps. Don't think, well, I can't really do anything special. Yes, you can, by opening your mouth, by saying, no, this is not acceptable to me. I love you, Uncle Jack, but you can't tell jokes like that. That bothers me. Well, then I'll remove myself, because the next time Uncle Jack sees you, it's going to get ticking that, okay, wait a minute, maybe I can have this conversation. Why does that bother you? Well, let me share with you what I learned, and maybe you can share what your experience is. So that's where it's got to start, the smallest part of just getting involved.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Before we move on to questions and answers, I just wanted to share the quote from Rabbi Hillel that Cliff put in the chat. As Rabbi Hillel said, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am not for others, what am I? If not now, when? Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important for us to keep in mind as we wrap up our session this evening, and as we go back into our families after we finish this call, to remember that we can be allies in a lot of different ways. And maybe it just starts with your community. Maybe it starts with introducing yourself to your neighbor, like Carmen suggested, mm-hmm. or calling and volunteering some of your time to an organization that supports communities of color. There's so many opportunities to be for others. Mm-hmm. So with that, I'm going to open this up to questions and answers. You can either, since there's a more intimate group of us, we can unmute ourselves if you'd like to ask your question aloud, or you can place it in the chat. And then myself, Carmen, Rabbi Mintz, and Andrew will be fielding these questions.
Hi, this is Julia. In the past, the Jewish communities have come together and joined other groups. Is there any effort for any of the organizations that are out here to join together to stand for something with another group, whether it's walking in a protest or supporting another group that's out there that is against racism and what's going on?
Absolutely. I can speak for my organization. I'm sure Andrew can speak for his organization as well. ADL has signed on to support many different groups, including the NAACP, to support a wide variety of those movements. As staff members, we were, encouraged to support, the movements that we saw fit in our own lives. The other thing, of course, is that we locally have reached out and we support and work directly with NAACP, the Urban League, and the Interfaith Council. They have been a real help in connecting us with other communities as well. Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer to your question is yes, and I'm just going to second everything that Katrina said.
Carmen, did you want to add anything to that? It kind of looked like you had something.
No, what you were saying is fine. I'm reading one of the questions that's in the chat.
Neil's question, I think, is really
kind of relevant in time, and I've taught lessons on this. First, you have to look at a historical perspective. What was the stars and bars, the Confederate flag? What was it symbolizing from a historical perspective, number one? In terms of monuments, I have people look at data when these monuments were put up. A lot of these monuments were not put up in 1866 or 1867 like that. If you look at when they were put up, it was very intentional of when and where they were put up and the times, and it was in particularly with the development of Jim Crow as a sign of intimidation. And then if you dig deeper into the whole succession and the Civil War and whatnot, the data is really there, and just tell people to research it. Now, for me personally, if these individuals want to keep these monuments, I think the monuments should be in a museum if that's where they want to have them pieced and want to say that's part of their heritage and their history and so on and so forth. Great, fantastic. But I don't believe tax dollars from a diverse constituency should be spent to maintain these properties on state and local grounds. Now, that's my own thought. I'm only speaking for myself. But I know that's a large majority, and I would be even willing to put a percentage of it, like 89 to 93% of these monuments were made, processed, and put up between 1912 and 1967. And that's very significant from a historical perspective. So when you're having that conversation with people, you know, that's just how you start off. Well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? I'm not going to walk around with the stars and bars on for obvious reasons. My mother would kill me, first of all, because I know the history. But yeah, and I know that's a conversation that a lot of people are having right now. I don't believe in having statues of Christopher Columbus being Caribbean. I'm like, you came into my house and ate a sandwich. I mean, what do you mean you discovered me? I was already here, you know? So I would say that would be a best method of doing it, Gil. You know, just data, just do a little timeline with them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I will also add, Andrew, I'll pass it back to you in just a second. I'm sorry. I will also add that we have a resource online that covers a wide variety of hate symbols and has one-pagers and other facts and details about what these things represent and stand for, and also how people are using them today to further their movement. Andrew?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, because I don't remember if it's the ADL. It may be the Southern Policy, Southern Poverty
Law Center. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But someone has online a database of with a map of where all of these Confederate statues are, and there are over 1,500, even with the few that have been brought down in the past few weeks. There's still over 1,500 statues, monuments still standing, recognizing Confederate leaders. So to add a Jewish perspective on this, right? The 90% of these statues don't date from the Civil War. They date from after 1912. Thank you. I think Courtney just shared it. Yeah. So. Yeah.
The Southern Poverty Law Center also has it because they have a file that's called Hate Watch.
Right.
And that's also part of their resource cycle also.
Right. So 90% of these were built after 1912, and over 50% were built between 1950 and 1967. So to put a Jewish perspective on that, this isn't like a statue of Hitler in Germany, right? This isn't tearing down history. This is like putting up a statue of Hitler 10 years from now, from today. So that is a really important perspective. We can have a conversation about what history needs to be preserved and where it should be, but those symbols specifically mean something, and in a Jewish context, there's a definitive example of that.
Absolutely. And I'm also sharing in the chat our list of hate symbols and what they mean and who they're related to. So it looks like on here, someone shared with me privately what specifically, and I think this is for Rabbi Mintz, what are some things about, outside of what we talked about in the beginning of the program, what are some things in Judaism that really drive us to standing up for social movements?
Well, I think the easiest place to go is the fact that we are reminded, I think it's over 37 times, that we were slaves in Egypt, and God took us out of there with a strong arm and an outstretched, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. The reminder that we ourselves experienced slavery, ironically, for 400 years. Does that sound familiar? And as we were mentioning in our breakout room, the memory of that, while it's many years gone from our active memory, we share that, we carry that in our DNA. And we're at a really interesting point in history where our Black brothers and sisters are feeling their history, and it is real to them today as if it was their parents, let alone their grandparents or great-grandparents. And so we share this common legacy, born of fear, I would say, fear of the other. And we need to remind ourselves of that.
Thank you, Rabbi. If we have a few more minutes for additional questions, if other folks would like to unmute themselves or put a question in the chat. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We'll be sending this out tomorrow to all of you, the YouTube recording, and we will also be sending out a link of resources. Andrew, did you want to say anything before we finish up our evening? Nope.
Been using Zoom for 4 months now and still forget to take myself off mute. It's really important for me to reiterate that it's certainly not my job or my position to tell anyone how to think or feel or vote or what actions to take politically. I have my views about what that means, but that's besides the point. What I think is most important here is that we are creating a dialogue, that we're creating spaces to have these conversations, and that we're using the right terms and the right language and the right ideas to make sure that those conversations can happen and be productive. And I am so thankful and proud of everyone who joined this call to say that they want to be part of that. So thank you all so much. I really want to thank my good friend Katrina for putting this program together. I want to thank Carmen. You are an excellent facilitator. I want to thank Gil again for really championing this program and making it happen and pushing us to make this happen. So thank you to all of you, and also to Rabbi Mintz for her beautiful words at the start of the program. I expect nothing less, of course, from Rabbi Mintz, but it's always appreciated. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you again soon, I'm sure.
All righty. Thank you.